My name is Mitchell Stevens. I'm a sociologist on the faculty here in the Graduate School of Education and co-convener with my faculty colleague Roy P. of Education's Digital Future. That's a lot to convene, Education's Digital Future. Roy regrets that he can't be here this evening. He's spreading the gospel in Colorado, giving a keynote address entitled, quote, Learning Sciences and Learning Analytics, Time for a Marriage. He says hi to everyone from the EDUCAUSE conference. But thankfully, the rest of the EDF team is here. And as I mention who they are, you've done this before, you guys, I'd like you to stand so the rest of you can get a sense of just how widely distributed our work on this project has been. Our team includes Roy and myself, Abby Larson, postdoctoral fellow, stay standing, okay? Laura Moorhead and Daniel Green, course assistants. Justin Wynn, Johanna Mansour, Holly Materman, Holly, hello, come on in. I'm announcing you. Administrative support, external relations, Heap Ho, webmaster, and other things, obviously. Chris Wesselman, photography. The entire Graduate School of Education IT team has somehow been enlisted in this. Very important, the enrolled students and fellow travelers in the class, Education 403X, Education's Digital Future. Yay! Stay standing. There will be a brief Piazza assignment for next week, just so you know. There's also, while I'm thinking about it, no, stay standing. I'm not done. There's also we have a slightly different plan for next week in class, so I'll mention something about that. And then the Graduate School of Education Dean, Claude Steele. Stand, Claude, stand. Yay! All right, thank you. You can sit, yeah. Now, some of the business people in the audience may be thinking, aha, another one of those overstaffed, excessively funded, elite university boondoggles. But in fact, our effort has been just the opposite. It's been supported largely by volunteer labor, and that volunteer labor includes our 4 panelists this evening, which we're very grateful for. At least I think I'm buying you dinner, but I think that's all I've got for you. We're a startup, frankly, and like many new ventures in this part of the world, our ambition is large. Our goal is to make Stanford University the world center for research and critical public discourse on digital education. Somebody has to be the world center, right? We'll undoubtedly need a little bit of venture capital to get there, but that's something we'll be talking with you about later. This evening, we are focusing our attention on course, credit, and institutional accreditation, the peculiar regulatory system of U.S. higher education. I say peculiar because in comparison with those of other industrialized nations, our system of regulating universities is extraordinarily diffuse. No U.S. national agency determines what makes a school or a class or a college instructor or course of study legitimate. No state agency does these things all by itself either. Instead, U.S. state and federal governments have long relied on, or one might say, deferred to, private, usually nonprofit accrediting agencies to certify the fitness of particular schools for public service. The evaluations of these private accreditation agencies were made crucially fateful in the middle of the 20th century when, as part of its massive and successful effort to make U.S. higher education the largest and most productive in the world, the United States federal government tied disbursement of federally subsidized grants and loans to accreditation. And Education's Digital Future, the class, has been spending the last several weeks laying out in admittedly schematic forms, this history and the political economy that underlay that system. And if you go to edf.stanford.edu to the 403X page and look at what happened in class, you'll see Daniel and Laura's write-ups of the things we discussed, and the readings are available there as well. So I'm not just making this up. I learned it in a class at Stanford. Very schematically stated, that mid-20th century bargain between government and higher education went like this. And again, very schematically stated. Government says, tell you what, colleges and universities, you tell us which schools among you are legitimate. Have a process for that. Follow that process. Don't certify every school. While you're at it, the government will take public money and put it into the pockets of citizens to make your services affordable to millions. And we, government, will actively promote college as the golden doorway to middle-class prosperity. We also will refrain from getting up in your business. We won't ask too many questions. In return, government says, we will ask you to provide some sort of college opportunity for pretty much everyone who desires it. And higher education said to government, government, you've got yourself a deal. And so it went for many decades after World War II and into the present. However, in recent decades, the political economy underlying that deal between higher education and government has shifted so substantially that the bargain itself has become newly problematic. To wit, 1. Unabated tuition escalation in higher education, linked to chronic contractions in state support for public university systems, has sent the cost of college soaring. Grant aid has not kept up with tuition, so students and their families are mortgaging more of their futures to obtain college educations. 2. Revolutions in computational capacity and data collection have made it possible to measure learning outcomes with a great deal more precision than was even conceivable 2 decades ago. 3. Revolutions in digital media have made it possible to imagine quality instructional delivery to thousands or millions at very modest cost. 4. Very ambitious, often profit-oriented new education ventures are eager to deliver quality instruction without squeezing themselves into the traditional organizational models currently expected by accreditation agencies. 5. College courses, college graduates, and colleges themselves are increasingly transnational phenomena, but our credentialing apparatus remains nationally and even regionally parochial. What then should college credit and institutional accreditation look like in education's digital future? To help us address, not answer, but address this very large question, we have assembled a plurality of voices. And I'll ask each of you to stand when I briefly introduce you. And I realized when I was preparing these remarks, we don't need flowery introductions anymore because you have LinkedIn. So I can just give you 2 sentences on each of these visitors. Richard Aram is professor of education and sociology at New York University, an internationally recognized authority on education and social stratification. He is the author most recently with University of Virginia sociologist Josip Aroksa of Academically Adrift, Limited Learning on College Campuses, published to fame and infamy by the University of Chicago Press in 2010. And if you're one of the 3 people in higher education who has not heard about Academically Adrift, you can sit down. You can go to the EDF website where I tweeted a story in the New Yorker last year about Academically Adrift. So you can get the Cliff's Notes of the Cliff's Notes. 2. Second, Terry Cannon is a higher education consultant working with universities, colleges, and law schools on issues related to accreditation, student achievement, and organizational change. She most recently served as Executive Vice President of the Western Association of Schools and Colleges Accrediting Commission for Senior Colleges and Universities, aka Stanford's Police Department. Among her current clients is the Minerva Project, whose founder is here, And I gossiped about him at lunch in the faculty club, and guess who was at the next table? It's now getting away from these people, which is creating an entirely reinvented university that will be highly selective, global, and exceptionally rigorous. Emily Goligoski is a designer and community lead at Mozilla Foundation, which focuses on creating a generation of people who make and edit, not just consume, the web. She is an alumna of the Stanford Graduate School of Education's Learning, Design, and Technology MA program. John Katzman may be, as several of my MBA students tell me, the quintessential education entrepreneur. Founder of Princeton Review and Tutor, now named 2U, Katzman is most recently the founder and CEO of Noodle, an education startup whose eponymous search engine helps students and parents find educational resources and schools. Thanks. So here's how this is going to work. I've asked each of the presenters to speak for 10 minutes, and I've even limited the number of PowerPoint slides. And we had a nice discussion in advance of this session, so they'll come up as in the order in which I introduce them. Then we'll bring all four of them up, and instead of having me dream up some interesting questions to ask them, they will each have the opportunity to ask questions of each other. And I'm committed to leaving a very large portion of time for a town hall session at the end. So please be ready to participate in this discussion very soon. Okay? Richard?
Well, thank you very much, Mitchell, for convening us here to talk about this important topic, credentials and the relationship between credentials and the digital future. And I think what would be helpful to start our thinking about that is to distinguish between two very different purposes of credentials. One is credentials for individuals, and the second is credentials that the system as a whole makes use of to govern its organizational logic, to facilitate organizational management and resource flows. For institutions, the credential is something very simple. It is something that signals one's competence and is used to, typically in the labor market, you signal competency and you use it as a closure device to keep other people out from the jobs you've attained. So as a PhD, I've got a credential that certifies my competence as a sociology professor, and people who don't have that PhD are denied access to those positions. Now, again, very, very different, though, the system logic, and I'll show you how shortly. In the U.S., as Mitchell pointed out in the introduction, much of our credentialing system is built around the basic unit of the credit hour. We accumulate credit hours on the way to a degree. I should say also there's a second piece of the credentialing system in the U.S. Informally that's around institutional characteristics. So a degree from Stanford might have a different value than a degree from San Francisco State, even though it has the same number of credit hours under it. And there's all sorts of institutional rankings out there that basically look at inputs into the system, aggregate them up, and report these institutional distinctions. Now, this system has worked fairly well for, as Mitchell said, for the last century. It's monitored largely by accreditors, and we're going to hear from Terry next on how that process unfolds. But I would, as an organizational sociologist, say that it's basically a process that involves a lot of ceremonial rituals. Rituals where one, for example, accumulates a stack of 200, 300 pages of some sort of an output, and then the accreditors come in and say, well, actually, you need 200 more pages, no problem. and you have the 500. Maybe they go to the library and check to make sure they're library books. It's ceremonial. It's ceremonial because the system, as Mitchell said, is based on good faith and trust. Good faith and trust, where it would be impolite. It would be inconvenient to look at any of the underlying assumptions that make up the model. So, for example, if they said, well, a credit hour legally, it's an hour in class and 2 hours out of class for each credit. Right? So if a student is in getting 12 credits a semester, should be spending 24 hours a week studying. Well, we know from the research that there's nothing like that going on in U.S. schools, in other schools, in other countries, perhaps, but not in the U.S. In fact, in the U.S., the average amount of studying per week is something like 12 to 13 hours per week. It's half of that. Right? And so so by the law of the credit hour, a lot of these college graduates really are only sophomores. If we truly applied the legal definition of what a credit hour is. Of course, it's much worse than that, because if you actually look at the data, they say a third of their time is studying in groups, which has no effect on learning outcomes objectively measured. Studying alone in the U.S. average of 8 hours per week. Average for full-time college students, that's a little bit more than an hour a day. Right? That sounds to me close to, if the legal definition of a credit hour is an hour in class, 2 hours, sounding close to fraud. And I say that seriously because we're talking about federal dollars, federal money that's being transferred from taxpayers to institutions based on a lie, and something that everyone knows is a lie. Right? In our study, 36% of the kids said we study alone less than 5 hours per week. So there's a problem. There's a growing problem with the underlying logic and the basis of it. And of course, there's also a problem as the 21st century unfolds, and there are these new alternatives that are online that don't involve seat time at all. So a system that worked pretty well at managing flow, at creating both individual level outcomes and system level outcomes, all of a sudden isn't adequate to the task in front of it. So let's talk specifically about what that problem is at the individual level and the system level. Well, at the individual level, I actually think there's not all that much of a problem. It's not that big of a problem. And I'll tell you why it's not that big of a problem at the individual level, because there's a growing use, there's always been these, but there's a growing use of individual performance-based assessments that are used to signal one's competence. This is not something new, right? We've had licensing exams for years and years. We've had GREs, right, where graduate institutions don't just look at the degree and the credit hours. They say, well, show us what you can do. And there's increasing. We're going to hear from Emily in a little bit about badges that are being used and developed. So there's employers are increasingly when students apply, when graduates apply for a job, giving them a competency exam before they give them. So at the individual level, there's not that big of a problem with the credentialing system that currently exists. Where the problem truly exists is at the system level. At the system level, we are incapable of determining how to do the organizational management to govern the resource flows. So again, as Mitchell said earlier, a lot of this is federally funded and subsidized. Well, should federal dollars go to online alternatives? Are they equivalent or not? On what basis can one determine their equivalency? This is a problem, a major problem at the system level that is going to have to be addressed to move the higher education system forward. And again, at the system level, the individual performance assessments are not adequate to the task of system-level management, right? If you give someone at the end of the day, can you do this? You can't base system-level resource flows on that. Why not? Because individual-level performances on these assessments are strongly determined by prior ability and aptitude. Prior ability and aptitude. Let me give a story from one of my mentors at UC Berkeley, where I was a grad student. He entered a graduate program and read in the program online, the PhD program, that one could take their candidacy exams whenever they wanted. He came in the summer, a couple months early, said, I can take it wherever I want. Well, I'm going to study what's on the exam. I'm going to study, and I would take the exam. And he took the exam before he started classes in the PhD program and passed. All the peers in his cohort hated him. All the advanced students in the program thought he was a hero because he showed the hollowness of the performance. So you can't use that kind of performance. The performance assessments are good for sorting and selecting students, but they're lousy for system-based management. You need something else. And what I'm going to argue today you need is something that looks like value-added assessment. Value-added assessment at the classroom or institutional level. That is, you need to be able to measure students at multiple points of time to see how much their performance grows and develops on something, how much they learned. And that is essential for being able to look at the contribution of an organizational unit. It also turns out to be what's essential for identifying practices, organizational practices that are linked to improved learning outcomes. So if at the end of the day you're interested in improving learning outcomes, you have to do this institutional level value-added assessment. And that, I think, is going to then come into higher education. It's going to come into higher education because, in particular, look at online education. Online education has an added problem because it's a new form that's abandoned other ceremonial practices. We talked about ceremonial practices of accreditation. The ceremonial practice of the contact hour, the faculty-student contact, where knowledge is just it's happening right now. It's happening right now. And because they've abandoned that, the form of instruction is illegitimate. It's illegitimate. I'm not saying it's not effective or not effective, but its legitimacy is suspect. And so, in order for it to gain legitimacy in a system that's based on rationality, it has to demonstrate its effectiveness. Right? In a system based on rationality, which is education, you have to demonstrate the effectiveness. And the way to demonstrate effectiveness is through value-added assessment, where you measure how students grow. And so that is coming. It's going to come into higher education through online education because there's the organizational logic is apparent and obvious. Now, let me conclude by just talking a little bit about sources for likely change, barriers, and obstacles to this unfolding. That is, to moving to a system where there's more value-added assessment of higher education. Okay, start off with the following recognition. Higher education in the U.S. is a mature, successful industry. It is a mature, highly successful industry. Do not forget that. Do not forget that. Because a lot follows from that. First, established organizations have huge incentives not to change. And they have huge capacity to contain, incorporate, and manage the organizational environment. Look, for example, look no further than the American Council of Education, which has taken 12 MOOC courses or 9 MOOC courses, and they're going to determine whether they've called together the presidents of higher education institutions. I'm not making this up. And they're going to determine whether or not those courses are worthy of credit. It's going to be an important determination. Of course, wink, wink, just because ACE says it's worthy of credit doesn't mean Stanford has to accept the credit. Doesn't mean you have to accept an AP credit. But they're dealing with it in a way just what you expect a mature industry to do. Second, the entrepreneurial and innovative institutions, some of them leaders in the audience today, they are relatively weak and powerless in the system. They have an interest in this, but they don't have the capacity to build and legitimate such assessment vehicles. Third, well, maybe government is going to come and solve this problem. It's the federal dollars, after all, right? The government would have an interest. Yeah, problem. Remember, it's a mature industry. Mature industries tend to do something it's called capturing the state, capturing state regulation. And so the higher education industry has been remarkably effective in Washington at lobbying to make sure that data is not collected and on many things, particularly on learning outcomes. And that's why in K-12 education, all the longitudinal data sets have measures of learning over time, but when they get to higher education, it's not there anymore. It's not there anymore because there's been, the accounts from Washington is there have been explicit lobbying attempts to block that collection of that data. Maybe they're institutional. Maybe the international actors like the OECD. They have a project called the EHELO project, Assessment of Higher Education Learning Outcomes. Full disclosure, I'm on the expert panel on that, advising them on their value-added models. Maybe it'll come through the international assessment community. Well, if you weren't paying attention in the fall, guess what the American Council of Education did with the private institutions in Canada and in Europe? They wrote a letter to the OECD protesting that the OECD was involved with assessing higher education learning outcome. They said this was irresponsible without first having a full conversation with all the stakeholders about the purposes and the aims. And can you imagine in K-12 education if the superintendents of New York and LA went to Pisa and Timms and said, we're worried about you assessing higher educational outcomes? It's scandalous. Scandalous. But this is exactly what you'd expect in a mature industry. So where's change going to come from? I'm actually a hopeful, optimistic person. I truly am about this in particular and in general life, but that's a dinner conversation. Okay, so where's change going to come from? Think about the history of U.S. higher education and where the data management systems and the measurement has come from before. It's come from the private foundations. The private foundations have stepped in over the last 100 years to build the machinery to allow for more effective organization of education in this system. And so it's, think about the Carnegie Foundation's role in developing the credit hour. But the Carnegie Foundation also developed standardized testing. They also were instrumental in that. The foundations will have a role in creating management systems and improving measurement. The measurement we have today is limited and imperfect. John is going to his final final discussion is going to talk about some of his concerns around the limitations of testing. And yes, the testing is imperfect, but that's where you need to make the investment to try and figure out how schools matter. Thank you.
Let's see. Oh, he's putting them up for me. Great. It says Mozilla Open Badges here. I don't know nothing about them. So let's see. You want to help me?
I think if you just go to the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
And then yours should be right
There's mine.
And then F5 to see the speaker view.
Thank you. Ta-da.
Can we get maybe the lights off in the front, Paul Michael or Heath? Thanks. Go ahead.
So thank you, Mitchell, again, for inviting all of us here and for your great start for our panel, Richard. I want to say a few kind of introductory things. Really, this is what I'm going to talk about here, kind of 4 major areas. But I want to pick up on a couple of points from Mitchell's introduction and build on them a little bit and emphasize a few more things that are going on in our political and economic climate for higher ed, in the higher ed industry, that I think are important as we talk about this big subject. One of them is the unmet demand for the college degree. In this country and all over the world. And in this country, of course, this is the pathway to upward mobility. It's what we all expect to do and want our children to do, is to get more education. It's the pathway to jobs. It's also a social and economic need right now for us to have more college graduates than what we have. And study after study is showing how in 25 years we're going to be millions of people short in this state alone, people with college degrees to fill the jobs. And all of this is taking place in an environment where our degree attainment levels, and Richard mentioned the international landscape for this, the degree attainment levels for the United States have dropped. So we're now 16th in the world in degree attainment for 25 to 34-year-olds. So that is a picture that nobody in government ever really wants to see, to say that we've dropped that far. And this is also at the same time that we have this tremendously different group of students that are seeking to go to college, changing demographics beyond anything that this country has really experienced. So we have older adult students that are now being called post-traditional students by some commentators. We have students who are first generation, more that are recent immigrants, thousands and thousands of students all over the state that are learning to speak English while they're going to college, that don't speak English as their primary language. And we have crazy enrollment patterns. So it used to be with bricks and mortar, 4-year undergraduate degree, the expectation, the mental model we all had of college is a student enters, they go to class, they meet their credit hours, see their teachers face to face in a room like this, and they finish in 4 years. And that just doesn't happen anymore. Only about 40% of them finish in 4 years, maybe 50 to 60% finish in 6 years, and the rest don't finish at all, if ever. And while they're finishing, they're accumulating units and credits from 5, 6, 10, 12 different colleges by the time they graduate, as well as some of these other sources that I'm going to be talking about. So in that climate, we also have a demand for the transferability of units. So one of the big issues in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago was students can't transfer their credits from community college to 4-year college, which is so true. The average student loses 20 units of credit when they go to a 4-year college from a 2-year college. So there's something wrong with that, and it really cuts in to degree productivity. So I thought that was an important point to raise at the outset to add to the points that Mitchell had made. I will say one little short sentence about finances, and that is that in addition to the rising debt load, the high default rate, the shift that's been created from grants to loans, we also have unstable stable institutions. And there are a lot of folks who think that the business model of higher ed is really not sustainable. And if you read some of the work about that, you'll know that just in the last couple of months, Moody downgraded 34 institutions. Bain and Company said that 1/3 of the institutions in the country are not on a sustainable path financially. So we've got big systemic problems all across the higher ed industry. And then finally, I want to emphasize the work that Richard has done on learning outcomes, because we've been hearing for years and years, students don't seem to be studying, students don't seem to be learning as much as they used to. Employers and the employer lobby in Washington, D.C. has been complaining bitterly. Students can't work as a team, they don't know how to write, they can't solve a problem. And Richard's book really, his deep study really demonstrated the change that we've seen and the lack of learning. And this is all of our responsibility to address. So into that, we have the disruptions that Mitchell talked about in the introduction, and those include providers of education and other kinds of services that are technology mediated, only available because of the technology, and are also built on other major shifts in the academic model, including an unbundled faculty model, which is really, really important. Unbundled faculty model. So we used to have professors of various ranks who did it all. They did advising, course preparation, created the syllabi, wrote the books, taught the classes, graded the papers, gave the grades, right? All of that has been deconstructed, and in most of these new providers, it's being parsed out to a number of different people, some of whom have faculty credentials, some of them don't. So that's one piece of it, all of these other providers, which you two are part of that landscape and what you do, and it'll be fun to hear from you. But the other piece of this is that there are some new institutions like Minerva that are trying to come out in higher ed and address some of these problems. Access, building capacity. Institutions in this country, bricks and mortar, really at capacity. Providing access, providing quality, learning how to use the technology to improve student learning by the data analytics that are available to us, doing the kind of formative assessment, ongoing assessment of students throughout their learning so that their learning deficiencies and gaps can be filled in and addressed during the process. So we have those two kinds of players, whole new institutions, and then this whole array of other players in the field, if you will, that we haven't had before. So with that as kind of the backdrop, I want to talk about accreditation, which has been a big part of my professional career working with 3 different accrediting agencies. I want to say a little bit about regional accreditation because that's the gold standard of ceremonial ritual that Richard referred to. So students, you probably already learned this through your last couple of class sessions talking about accreditation. The country is divided into a crazy quilt of 6 different regions. So, for example, the Western region has fewer than 200 institutions at the 4-year and above level, about 150 community colleges. It's only 2 states, California, Hawaii, and then the Pacific Islands. Whereas the North Central region, which stretches down into what most of us think of as the Southwest, but is still called North Central, covers 19 states and has 1,200 institutions. So that's just an example of how that how accreditation is kind of crazy. Accrediting agencies work in a triad with the state and the federal government. Really, that's the group, the 3-entity group that oversees higher education. And in the last decade, accreditation's been trying very hard to move from just an input evaluator into an outcomes evaluator. And they've moved from being a quality improvement, kind of collegial peer review exercise for institutions, to something that really is a legitimate accountability for institutions. And it's been a really big stretch for them, and they've only been partially successful. The challenges to accreditation that exist right now are really profound, and it's very possible that accreditation as we know it won't exist in a decade from now. It's going to have to change dramatically, or I think that it will be permanently disrupted. And these are some of the things that people say about accreditation. They say that accreditation costs too much, adds little value, and this is a quote, intrusive, prescriptive, and granular, doesn't assure student learning or quality, cannot possibly address the vast array of institutional types, especially the new ones. It's secretive, self-referential, not useful to the public. It's slow, it's ineffective at getting rid of subpar institutions. There's more. It stifles innovation, and it can't keep pace with changes in delivery, organizational types, and structures. I don't think it's all that bad. And it's all we've got. So even the folks who are saying these things write these glorious papers about this, and at the end of them they say it's the best thing we've got. We need to reform it, not get rid of it. Nobody wants a ministry of education that is running all of this, right, Richard? They would not want that at NYU. So I'm going to come back to that, but I do want to pick up a little bit on what Richard mentioned, which is this cottage industry, which is completely unregulated, of entities that recommend college credit. So ACE is the big one that Richard mentioned already. This is an organization that has been recommending college credit for various activities and work that's done outside the auspices of an accredited college, like courses given by professional associations, employers, military, the college-level examination program, which has 33 examinations that cost $80 a piece. You can earn up to 90 units of college credit by taking those, and then you'll only need a year before you get your degree, which you can now do all online. So besides ACE, which partners with hundreds of entities that it gives credit for, they also work with about 2,000 institutions that accept this kind of credit. There's another entity called National College Credit Recommendation Service, a little less popular, fewer partners. There's the Council on Adult and Experiential Learning, CAO, which some of you may have heard of, which gives credit by portfolio. And all of these entities will create transcripts that look like a college transcript that have all of the different sets of competencies that are supposed to be represented. Mitchell's telling me I have to stop, so I want to say, before I do, just a couple of quick things. One is that I think that what I just described in terms of credit recommenders is not really going to work. I think we need to have more quality control over that. We really don't know how that's being done, and it has to be reviewed very carefully as more and more institutions accept more of these credits. Stanford and Harvard don't accept them, by the way. But there are 2,900 institutions, which is most of them, that do accept some of the recommendations. The second thing I want to say is that accrediting agencies have to change. And if they don't, they're going to explode. They have to become both more rigorous in the way that they deal with institutions, especially in the area of effectiveness and student learning and financial sustainability. But at the same time, they have to be more friendly to innovation because they're keeping out new institutions that would do perhaps a better job and address some of the challenges that we're all facing. And then finally, and this relates, I think, to a point Richard was also trying to make, is that we don't really have a shared idea anymore about what a college degree is. And if you look at a college degree that's cobbled together, starting with advanced placement courses that kill off, a semester or two of a college education, and then the person accumulates portfolio, CLEP, and other kind of credit from many, many different sources, and has only taken a handful of courses to get their degree, I think we have to ask ourselves whether that degree really represents a body of knowledge, a set of intellectual skills, a depth and breadth that we think means a degree. And it worries me not only that that is happening, but that what it's doing is reinforcing the social structure that we have in place, and that wealthy and privileged people and a few selected others who are highly exceptional will get an elite and very good undergraduate education, and everybody else will be over here to kind of fend for themselves and won't have what they need to be good citizens and to be effective workers and contributors in our economy. Thank you.
A lot of quotable quotes, Terry. Be warned, we're tweeting.
First, I want to thank Mitchell so much for hosting this important conversation. I could not be more thrilled to be here. And Terry brought up the theme of transferability, and that's something that I want to talk about quite a bit because it's basically the backbone that the Open Badges idea was founded on. So you look at this slide and you see Mozilla, and you think, Mozilla, web browser, what does this have to do with education? And Mozilla has created a foundation that is really focused on educating the next generation of web makers. And these are people who don't just use the internet, they really shape it and they make it. And we recognize that for those individuals of many shapes and sizes, it's really important that they're able to show what it is that they're capable of in really nuanced ways. A couple of years ago, our team started to really notice a sort of growing interest in badge communities, particularly among coding communities. So this sort of burgeoning form of social currency. Yet, it wasn't possible for badges that I earned on Khan Academy to be interoperable with my badges from code school. And so we really have asked this question of how is it that badges might better represent learning as it's gained across academic institutions, professional sectors, as well as sort of individuals' passion projects. And so with that, we've really thought about capturing informal learning through this, the form of badging, which is something that we all recognize, from Boy and Girl Scouts, all the way to the digital age. And many of the badges that you may already be familiar with online are image-based files. What's different about open badges is that open badges are really information-rich. So they include metadata specifications about when a badge was earned, how it was earned, the criteria behind that badge, as well as who verifies it. So it really becomes a more authentic way of showing what it is that you do than, let's say, a line on a resume that really can't be verified. And we really want to think about badges in terms of formal and informal learning. So as this ecosystem has grown, it now includes more than 400 organizations that have issued over 45,000 open badges. To us, this becomes a pretty powerful proof of concept. Clearly it's an experiment, and we're not quite sure where this ends up going, but we are really excited by the number of formal and informal educational institutions, nonprofits, multinational corporations, and groups interested in professional development that are really taking to this idea. And so we're left with the question, how do we get there? We've developed the technical infrastructure that makes it possible for the badges that you earn across the different parts of your life to really be portable and shareable on the web. But obviously, this involves much more than Mozilla Foundation. This involves the badge issuers that I mentioned, as well as individual badge earners like yourself, and display organizations. And I think this really is important because accreditation simply isn't working for our systems, as Richard mentioned. For individuals who are trying to gain new skills, those sort of post-traditional learners. For veterans, for young learners who are trying to explore and make the web. And it simply doesn't work for organizations that are trying to teach and employ us. So this is just a quick visual to kind of give you a sense of what this ecosystem is coming, the shape that it's coming to take. So you've got badge issuers on the top who completely determine the content and curriculum behind their badges. They don't need to come to Mozilla for any kind of approval. If anything, we make all of our tools open source for them to fork the code, and to remix it. They issue badges. They put them out in the ecosystem. badge earners, obviously very excited about this, then are able to push those badges to their Open Badge backpack. And this is really a badge management utility. If you go to openbadges.org, you can earn your first badge in a matter of minutes. But the really exciting thing is when those badge earners push their badges to display sites. That could take the form of my WordPress blog, social network updates, professional networks, etc. And sort of getting back to this larger question of, okay, so where's the there? The idea really is how badges may just become one very simple form of reward and recognition to help unlock new learning and career opportunities. And so I'd be remiss not to mention the number of higher education institutions that are adopting open badges. Purdue University has been sort of out in front of this with a competency-based framework that they've created called the Passport System. University of Illinois has been, just growing leaps and bounds in this area. But I think actually, even more than the number of higher ed institutions embarking in this space, is really seeing the way that individual educators are really beginning to dig into this in meaningful ways. Recently, I was on the phone with a 7th grade teacher in the UK. I guess it would be Form 7. I'm not quite sure how that system works. But she was saying that she could spend all of her time trying to convince her school district that badges really were a good idea and trying to get them to put resources behind sort of integrating with the technical infrastructure. And instead, she decided to make this an assignment for her class and to really invite them to design and issue badges to one another. And I think that sort of microcosm becomes actually really much more exciting than the NASA's and the Intel's issuing badges, is really where it's happening on the ground and really benefiting individual badge earners at the point of badge receipt. And so with that, I'll sort of just turn us over. But we can talk more sort of about the specifics. The idea I really want to leave you with is that Open Badges is one of many, many different approaches to new forms of accreditation. And really what it is that we're trying to do is all about transferability for skills, literacies, passion projects, and interests.
Thanks, Emily.
I think they're just right there.
Let's see. Well, that's your presentation, I see. Oops. Well, thank you, Mitch, and everyone. So I ran the Princeton Review for many years, and I think of myself as the ghost of unintended consequences. They say that every problem starts life as a solution to a problem. And as we go down the road of changing accreditation, I kind of want to throw out some ways in which we may be creating other ones or worse.
That's the entire discipline of sociology, John.
That's so the first thought is standards and remediation. The question of, we have universities right now at every level who give a tremendous number of remedial courses, and the thought was really good. You can think of a strong student otherwise who has a couple of holes in his game, and we're going to allow him to solve it. So we bring him into the school, solve those, and move him on. The reality is that remediation is used by community colleges to utterly muddy their mission, and in fact, to sometimes the remedial students crowd out students who are college ready. And they're used by the for-profits who have a unlimited capacity, especially online, but even offline, they could build more campuses pretty quickly, and a huge profit motive to take in more students, to bring in students who are in no way college ready and rack up hundreds of billions of dollars of bad debt. How we think about that, I think, is, whoops, I'm just having trouble clicking here. There we go. How we think about that might be in terms of setting admission standards a little bit more rigorously. What does it take to do college-level work at your institution? And stopping schools as part of an accreditation process from accepting students who don't meet those criteria. Colleges should teach college-level courses exclusively, which sounds like a really simple thing. But I can feel a lot of people just looking at that concept and saying, well, that's a problem. We're going to stop access to a tremendous number of students. I'm actually unworried about that. There are a tremendous number of tech companies and other institutions delighted to address that gap. And if you think about it, most of the skills we need are English and math skills that are largely taught in middle school, right? So those remedial courses pull on a body of tech and content that's being created in great mass. You really could drive down the cost of taking a student from uncertainly ready for college to ready for a whole bunch of colleges for well under $1,000. And you don't need to address Title IV. You don't need to take on a lot of debt. What you need to do is start thinking in terms of $200, of $300, of testing your mettle. Are you ready to learn? Of largely online courses for students who, at the point that they're ready for college, which could be 18, but could be 48, that we are providing an on-ramp that's coherent. But the starting point for that market is going to be the inability of schools to take in students who aren't ready. I also think in terms of the MOOCs and the move towards a flipped model. So this is a traditional model of education, textbook, there's a lecture, and then we discuss. And increasingly in a flipped model, you do asynchronous work instead of a lecture, right? So everybody comes into class having read up whatever, having looked at a bunch of online materials, and then ready for discussion. Well, if you think about where the world's headed, the textbook companies are all taking their materials, bringing them into rich media, making them modular and interactive and collaborative in order to have a business 5 years from now. And the MOOCs are taking their lectures, which started life as just a video of a college professor, making them modular and interactive and collaborative in exactly the same way. What's actually happening is you're going to see just a body of asynchronous material, right? That college professors in higher-end schools or the colleges themselves in entry-level tier schools curate into courses. So a whole bunch of materials. It might come from Creative Commons. It might come from Pearson. It might come from Coursera. It might come from the professor himself. Here are things that you should do before and after class to be ready for it and to reinforce. And then there's discussion. And so I actually believe that the MOOCs, in the end, are not competitors of colleges, that the accreditation they get, that their ability to give credits won't actually end up mattering. What will matter is when they realize that they're actually competitors of Pearson. And I think you're going to see some really interesting stuff there. But the point here is that the top of the pyramid, the discussion part, is 85 or 90% of the marginal cost, of the variable cost of a college-level course, right? That's the hard part. Everything else at scale becomes a rounding error. So you've got a tremendous incentive to see a race to the bottom. As we move away from credits and we move towards competency-based, mastery-based, whatever the kind of education you want to see, it could either be a small group of well-qualified students working with a professor, working with each other, collaborating, learning from each other, or it could be a correspondence course, right? How do we see the top of the pyramid And if we don't think about it as part of the accreditation process, that race to the bottom ends up in a place that I'm not sure everybody's going to be delighted by. The final thing I just want to talk about is the notion of slow accountability. So the way a lot of these processes start is we have these long-term outcomes that we think we want, that we know we want, in terms of life success, high incomes, happiness, whatever it is that a given college is looking to create for its graduates. And we all say, and this is true of K-12, and it's true of every sort of institution, we're impatient. We don't want to wait till we see those outcomes in order to accredit the school or in order to rate it. So what we do instead is we come up with something short-term that correlates to long-term success. And there are a lot of things that correlate, like these tests that Richard was talking about. And then we attach stakes to those short-term things, like the SAT. And as soon as you attach stakes, as soon as that becomes important to the institution, you're going to see a whole bunch of test prep. You're going to see a movement that, for instance, all the business schools right now know that they're being rated by U.S. News in large part based on the average income of their graduates over the first 5 years. So very few business schools encourage anybody to be an entrepreneur. You look at the numbers. When business schools start entrepreneurial programs, they actually end up with fewer entrepreneurs as graduates. It's scary stuff, but it totally makes sense because it's the kids who go to Wall Street who make the school have high rankings. And in the same way, you look at dancers, you look at all sorts of professions, trying to evaluate everybody by the same metric can't work, except to set up incentives for schools to move away from anybody like that and move towards people who have more traditional short-term outcomes. Instead, if you look in a long-term approach, what you might end up with is saying, as a school, your job is to create goals. What are you trying to do? And it doesn't have to be a monolithic goal. What's your engineering department trying to do? What's your entrepreneurial program? What are the tracks that you see your graduates pursuing? What are clear, definable, measurable goals that you can set for yourself and publish? And then number two, as a part of your accreditation, measure it. It's not a goal unless you're going to be responsible for measuring against it by surveying and through a whole bunch of other kind of things that weren't possible 10, 20, 30 years ago, but are possible now. And number three is take that data and in a anonymized way make it available both to groups like U.S. News and accreditors, but also to the students themselves to use in a big data kind of approach. Students like you had outcomes who wanted to do things at our school like the entrepreneur program, like the dance program, whatever it is that you're majoring in. Here were their outcomes. Here's how they felt 1 year out, 5 years out, and so forth. The fact is, I'm a believer in diplomas. I'm a believer in the U.S. education system. Our university system is our fifth largest service export. It's something we're known for doing really, really well. And again, all of this is just to say, as you reinvent it, don't break it.
Come on up, guys. What a sophisticated a sophisticated foundation for a discussion. Thank you. I powwowed with the panelists, and we decided to forego the Dick Cavett part, for those of you who are old enough to remember that. And we'll just open it up. And Daniel Green, I believe, and Abby Larson have microphones. So, and when you make a comment or ask a question, we're going to ask that you stand and somehow identify yourselves, because we're trying to create a little more social closure here. But you can identify yourself however you want. And just because you ask a question doesn't mean anybody has to answer it, let alone all four of you answering it. Okay? So, Mary Huber.
Hi, I'm Mary Huber from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and participating in our reexamination of the Carnegie Unit, or as it's known in higher education, Credit Hour. My question for the panel is the issues that we're facing here cannot be unique to the U.S. I'm wondering how other countries are responding to these questions, what they're doing to recognize new kinds of institutions and new kinds of badging or skill certification.
Sure. Recently, we were talking to an organization that is a potential issuer in Uganda. And one thing that they were complaining about was that many members of their particular community that did not have computer science degrees but ended up learning programming skills informally or later in life were not really being fairly considered when it came to job opportunities. And so they've started to use badges as a way to sort of validate lifelong learning, really, in a way, and got really, really excited that this was going to sort of, flip the employment equation on its head. And I almost found myself kind of tempering it a little bit to say badges really are one way to get at that, but I think that it's a much bigger conversation about how is it that we as individuals really put our best foot forward and really robustly present what it is that we're capable of. And I actually am curious to hear from the other members of the panel sort of thinking about this in an international context, because I think it's really easy for us to really be focused on American higher ed in particular, but I'm just curious of other examples.
Yeah, let's do that for a minute. It would be very helpful.
I can throw out a little bit of stuff.
No, go ahead.
Of course, in many other countries, the European countries, the systems are controlled at the national level, and so there's a much tighter organization of what's offered. There's also, as of course you know, in Europe, the attempt to through the Bologna process to make degrees equivalent so that they have the same content across traditional offerings. There's also in Europe efforts to collect basic data on how many hours, for example, students study, and see whether how look at the extent to which the systems are comparable in that way. And of course, for those who don't know it, the only country in Europe that has fewer hours studying for full-time students than the U.S. is the Slovak Republic. Every other country, more academic time. I don't know the online question in particular. In some ways, my guess is online education is less of an imperative there, because higher education is half the price in general than it is here. The U.S. has a very unique model around residential higher education that has a very a large part of it. The relative cost is not that little pyramid of instruction on top there. It's all the social pieces that go along with the definition of what it means to be a college student today. And also, as we know historically over time, in the last decades, that's the part of higher education that's growing. And that little pyramid of instruction on the top is diminishing, number of full-time faculty. And so, in some ways, the online revolution, it's occurring at the periphery, because the real issue is all this social part of higher education that no one's yet. Well, some of the startups are discussing, but in general, the higher ed industry, the established organizations are not really taking on how to rethink that.
John
One
and
thing
Terry,
just to follow up on what Richard was talking about is the transcripts of college education in the European academic community are also descriptive. So they're much more portable. So they have much more extensive detail about the competencies that students have met. And this qualifications framework sets those out, and so everybody knows what a degree means, which addresses kind of the issue that I was trying to get to at the end. But I do think it's an important difference.
Looking more at Asia, there are really two groups of things going on. In India, China, and a bunch of countries, the way they've dealt with online education is to say, we're not going to have that. They sort of took a look at what was going on here and said, that's not working. So until they have figured it out, the answer is they're not dealing with new modalities. The countries that are also kind of noteworthy are Dubai and the UAE and Singapore. Especially right after 9/11, when we kind of closed our doors a little bit to immigration, a bunch of countries stepped up hard and are looking to build export industries in education and are meeting some success. So they're addressing it as a business opportunity more than anything else.
And also, I want to say, a lot of those institutions are seeking accreditation from American accrediting agencies. So they're offering American-style education and trying to get accredited by WASP and others.
Others? Yep.
Thank you very much for speaking to us. My name is Greg Bybee. I'm a graduate student, Master's of Education and MBA at Stanford. And sorry, I'm getting over a cold. Richard, you set up sort of the motivation behind value-added assessments. And John sort of set up a similar idea, but more on an individualized level, that schools could set their own criteria for evaluation. And so I guess two questions come to mind. One, are your views compatible or incompatible? Do you prefer more of a universal standard or more individualized? And second, if you could speak a bit more on, yes, we have data and this, collection ability, but how exactly do we measure it? Is it before, after tests? You mentioned surveys, but can you speak a little more on that?
Sure. In some ways are compatible because I'm all in favor of doing what he does as well as doing creating data that's comparable across institutions. So I have no problem institutions choosing to define their own goals and provide and measure that and provide information on that. That would be great. However, that is not adequate to the task that system-level management and organization requires, because you need to be able to compare across units to be able to identify which programs are in need of improvement, and to address them and to fix them. And unless you have some sort of comparable data on something, you can't do that. Now, what should that data be on? Well, some sort of pre- and post assessments on generic skills, I think, would not be a bad idea. The measurement science is not great there. These instruments are limited and imperfect. They need to be developed. Of course, the federal government could invest in it, except I've said they've chosen not to. But the measurement science is not great, but you would think that would be something. I think you can also survey students about their educational experiences when you're asking them to report on what they're actually experiencing. When you ask them to make judgments about things, the data is virtually useless. So if you say, how much do you think you learned? That data which was the basis of a lot of the research in higher education that advocated more social engagement on campuses, more spending on social activities and clubs. That data has nothing to do with objective measures of learning. So individuals are not very good at making judgments about things, but they're very good at reporting how many hours you study. How many times do you ask to write in class? Do you get feedback on your writing? And those types of questions would be perfectly useful to survey across institutions and get measures. Now, the last thing, and then I've spoken too long, I'm all for the tortoise and the hare, the long-term evaluation and assessment of outcomes. But here's the problem. The further you get away from the school, the harder it is to identify school-level differences. right? Variation, the further you get away, doesn't track with school level differences. And so even early labor market outcomes do not track across school differences. They track within programs. A business major does better than an education major, sorry. But you can't identify even institutional selectivity differences, early labor market. And so you gotta, if you're gonna look for differences in what schools do, you gotta look at outcomes that are closer in.
Okay. John, then I have a bone to pick. Go
Three
ahead.
quick points. One, the testing industry has been around about 100 years, and it's kind of over on this stuff. I will have jetpacks before we have tests that reliably measure, the kinds of things we're trying to hit at here in a way that's not easily gameable. Number two, in terms of gaming, think about stakes for a minute. Let's say that you have measures along the lines of the CLA, along the lines of what you've learned in terms of your reasoning skills, and they have no stakes at all. I just want you to take this test because we're trying to measure the school. Well, the same thing will happen as what used to happen in K-12. No one will care. You just fill out the dots because why bother? Once you attach stakes for the student, now you're going to have test prep. Now college will be prepped for those reasoning tests, and you're walking down a road that I think is a very, very tough thing to balance. Many more problems than solutions there. And finally, if it doesn't matter, Richard, which school you went to for long-term outcomes, why bother measuring it? They're all great.
Yeah, so I'm going to pile on here because just for fun, Richard, right? You're sounding kind of industrial era to me because you're calling for a sort of uniform standard of value added. And Emily just beautifully offered a world in which we have basically unlimited numbers of credentials and a plurality of ways in which those credentials could be validated or verified. Some could be crowdsourced, some could be test-based, some could be internationally normed, some could be ones that I make up with my girlfriends in my bedroom. Like, why do we have to go through, creating some sort of universal assessment that we're going to hold all schools accountable for? Why don't we encourage a great fertility of certifications and be agnostic about particular schools relative to...
Because you're spending taxpayer dollars.
We don't have to spend taxpayer dollars anymore.
Well, higher education in this country couldn't exist without it being, it's all based on subsidy. It's all subsidized by the government. And everyone talks about diminishing state-level contributions to higher education, but the feds have more than made up for that. And so, you want to take all that, take that all away, and fine. But if you're asking people to subsidize this entity, you have to have some way of determining that what is being offered is sound.
I'm looking at you, Emily. I'm looking at you.
I guess the question of soundness, and I don't know the answer here, but the question of soundness comes back to me to a question of who's evaluating that. Who is determining the soundness? I have to argue for sort of a learner-centric determination of where is there meaning for me and how do I want to share that? I'm really wary of having that feel like a top-down decision.
Let me also say that I think all learning doesn't necessarily merit college credit. So I think what they're doing is fantastic. And some of it may merit college credit, and some of it might not. And I think that's perfectly okay, right? So I think we need to be careful to make that distinction. I have to say that as an accreditor, it's very difficult to evaluate an institution on learning outcomes because we have let all those flowers bloom. And so when we go in as accreditors, and some of you may have been on accreditation teams before, you're looking at a very specific mission of an institution that says that this is how they're teaching it, these are the standards they're setting. They may or may not have very well-framed outcomes. They may or may not have good assessment tools for assessing learning. They may or may not benchmark against anything else. Mm-hmm. What's an accreditor to do? It's built on trust, like Richard was talking about. The accreditor has to kind of look at this and go, okay, well, it looks like they've got a reasonable process. Mm-hmm. And, they've got a decent number of people completing, so I guess that's okay. So they can't do a very rigorous examination of the quality and level of learning.
And just to be clear, I'm not saying there should be a federal-based accountability system where revenues are flowing from that. What I am saying is that you have to do value-added assessments of types of institutions to get a sense of what they're offering and whether or not they're comparable or not. And you could have a sense, these online alternatives. A lot of them look fairly similar. Are the learning outcomes ballpark what traditional delivery systems are? That's all you need. That's all you would need to know. You wouldn't have to kind of do value-added assessment on every kid, on every program, and tie dollars to that. That would be a complete disaster, as John and I agree. But right now we don't have that effort to understand even basic differences in what produces different rates of growth.
Let me make a case we do a little bit, and I don't mean this the way it's going to sound. As in my professional life, I am O for HBS. I have never successfully hired someone from Harvard Business School, had them work out and add a lot of value to my companies. Now, they are terrific in 100 different ways. They make great finance people, great leaders, but within smaller entrepreneurial companies, maybe they, or at least mine, it hasn't worked, which means I stopped hiring them. Right? To some degree, there is a true accountability happening because employers, whether it's a factory hiring community college workers from down the road or companies hiring grads of top business schools, companies make decisions every day. And that collective decision is actually really important to the schools and to the people going there.
Yes, and that's why if you look at U.S. industry over the last few decades, they've outsourced jobs in engineering, design, all over abroad, and they've imported engineers.
Emily.
One thing on the sort of collective decision-making that I did want to just circle back in reference to the question. We're often asked about whether we see ourselves as the arbiter of badge value, and I very firmly say not at all. I think that the more badges there are in this ecosystem, the better, because individuals will determine really what works for them. And I think those will, those particular courses, that stats class will rise in popularity naturally. This does become a really big question when we talk about collaboration and other sort of soft skills and sort of mapping that to employability. And I think, really it remains to be seen what the sort of outcomes are there. But I think better matching what it is that you need when you're trying to hire with the competencies that a learner has is absolutely vital.
Some more questions, comments. Way in the back, there's an arm with a white sleeve on it. Yes, you, sir, with the glasses.
So this question.
Stand up, please.
Oh,
thank you. Introduce yourself.
I'm Daniel. So this question could be directed at the Open Badges representative, but it could also be more open to people who are talking about credentials more broadly. So should the number of badges or credentials available be unlimited or not? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of kind of an unlimited versus limited approach?
Does anyone else want to start with this one? Absolutely unlimited is my strong stance. One, I think it gives issuers of these credentials or of these badges a chance to put their work out into the world. Really, I think the cost of education withstanding, the idea of being able to pull content that is relevant to me as a learner in free and accessible ways, the more options I have, the better. The other side of that does get into sort of a quality control question. You, of course, can make the case that a lot of that ends up being garbage. Do I want a credential for tying my shoes? Maybe not. If that's a Nike-sponsored credential, we just open up a whole other sort of minefield. But my strong sense is that the more options, the better.
John?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I learned only a couple months ago that I've been tying my shoes wrong my entire life. So, the way I think you should think about badges is as atomic units, and the question of who is assembling those into molecules is really where this starts getting interesting. That as an employer, I'm not looking. I read a resume in 15 or 30 seconds, right? Like, okay, graduated Stanford with this and this, and okay, I'll read that one further. I don't want to have to look at every course you ever took and figure out for myself. But somebody assembling it and saying, yeah, I'm going to give a badge, I'm going to give a credit for that combination of things is I think, much more interesting.
Here.
Why? Who's going to decide?
Sir, unlimited. Here, Stan, please. Yeah.
Hello, Jeremy Jimenez, second year PhD in International Comparative Education here at Stanford. With regard to accountability measures for the university, given the fact that it's our fifth largest export, and there are many international students consuming that, and the federal subsidy issue, should they be detached from U.S.-centric priorities, do you think, number one? And number two, do you think such standards can or should cover issues such as civic-mindedness, capacity for empathy, commitment to lifelong learning? Should these be things that can or should be implemented in a university performance accountability measure?
Can I get a badge for empathy?
Several, actually.
Well, I can answer the second question first. I think the way accreditors look at this is that every institution should be free to set its own mission. And so the emphasis that it places on civic engagement or social justice is up to the institution. But then the institution should be held accountable by the accrediting agency for doing something to promote those values, if that's what they're trying to do. Now, that said, WASC just adopted as one of its core commitments a requirement that every institution must do something for the public good. And I think that was adopted in a sense as a kind of pushback against the idea that for-profit institutions are driven primarily by the profit motive, the way that you described it, and aren't doing enough of the social good part of what it means to provide education to students.
So jump in. Yeah, I think researchers and institutions should assess anything that they're interested in. The federal government shouldn't be involved in it, but researchers and institutions for sure. The other one about the higher ed in international perspective, I'd make the following 2 points. One, we have the best doctoral programs in the world. And we do because the higher education institutions in the U.S. are focused, when they're not focusing on entertaining undergraduates with social activities, on research and scholarship. And so having faculty focus on research and scholarship is perfectly aligned with having great doctoral programs producing scientists and PhDs. So I think we have the best of those in the world. Second, at the undergraduate level, a lot of what I think attracts foreign students has to do with the U.S.'s position in the global economy and global political economy. And so I think we deceive ourselves thinking that they're coming necessarily because they think that the education is so superior to what they can get at home they think there's a real value in having an experience in the U.S. when the U.S. has a dominant position in the world, and that would exist even if our institutions produced nothing at all.
Emily and John, you get 30 seconds if you like. Okay. Let me give you a sense of how you can continue to participate in these conversations. As far as I'm concerned, you all have made it extraordinarily clear just what an intellectually exciting time this is for higher education. I feel like a lot of higher educators, we went through a sky is falling phase. I don't know which stage of grief we're in, but perhaps we're beyond denial, and we're not quite to acceptance. But I think we are at a moment of exceptional fertility in which it's possible to ask pretty fundamental questions about the nature of our enterprise. And it has been our ambition with this convening to provide as many opportunities as possible to have those discussions. A very easy way for you to join us if you're within driving distance or commuting distance of some sort is every evening every Tuesday evening from 5:15 to 7:05. We meet in this room. You can see the full syllabus online. Next week we'll be hearing from a Graduate School of Education, John Walensky, on the intellectual property implications of this moment. He'll be obviously won't be giving us the answers for that one, but creating conditions for another conversation. And I should say also that the core group of people who come weekly to those sessions has really generated really memorable and indelible insight that we're trying to accumulate. In fact, this panel emerged out of some discussions we had last fall in which we kind of collectively bumped into our own ignorance about accrediting and accreditation as a regulatory system. So I see this as a kind of direct outgrowth of the kinds of exchanges we've had on those sessions. So those are open, again, each and every week. Join us anytime. We also have a series of public fora. This is the third on the 26th of February. Also online, you'll see a panel on gaming to learn that my colleague Roy P. will convene. Of course, you can follow us on Twitter. We have regular updates of cool stuff that we think you ought to read. We celebrated the 40th anniversary of Schoolhouse Rock recently. So there are lots of ways to participate. Thank you so much for coming, and please join us again. Thank you.